Did you
All
mean
right.
to make me the co-host or Gabe the co-host?
I thought I made both of you.
Oh, okay, I saw Gabe. Never mind. It's all good.
The Good evening, good evening. We first, as I'm fond of saying, destination check. We had scheduled this to be a session talking about the laws of marriage and egalitarian marriage and the halachic ins and outs.
Did you mean to make me the co-host or Gabe the co-host?
Oh wait, sorry.
Oh, okay, I saw Gabe. Never mind.
Deja vu. We took that. We hit pause on that actually just this weekend. We realized that we weren't going to have time to talk about Pesach before Pesach. Pesach sort of sneaks up on us this year, as it does so many years. It's still just a month after Purim, but because it falls in March, blah, 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 blah. This would be our chance to talk about Pesach, and often we have a chance to have like a little bit of teaching and give and take on Pesach before it happens, but with the pandemic, that becomes more difficult. So we're going to, in a future session, talk about the issues of halachic marriage and egalitarian marriage and all these other sorts of things. But tonight we're going to talk Passover, which is to say, I don't know what the order is. I think I'm going to do 15 minutes on Pesach, and then Rabbi Sisi is going to do 15 minutes, and then we're going to have time for Q&A, for any questions that people have, not just about what we talk about, but because there's always questions about what do we do with this Passover, that Passover. And again, we're last year was obviously memorable. This year, we're clearly still in pandemic mode, alas. Last year when we said that we were left saying next year in Jerusalem, and assume that next year we would all be together, and here we are still same. So
Rabbi?
Yep.
Before you jump into this, do you want to make any comment on the Israeli Supreme Court decision today?
Oh, we can talk about Israel. Yeah, it's more than happy to. Thank you. That's a good place to start. Just briefly, yesterday the Israeli Supreme Court allowed for made a ruling allowing for non-Orthodox conversions, i.e., conversions done under the auspices of the Reform Conservative Movement, for individuals with that status to be counted as Jewish for the purposes of citizenship. That actually has long been the case for conversions done outside of the land of Israel. This was for individuals who convert in the state of Israel. So so it doesn't impact, marriage or death. Still the chief rabbinate controls issues of who can get married in the land of Jews getting married in the land of Israel, or if you can be buried in a Jewish cemetery. This does not affect that. This only affects if you're allowed to sort of take citizenship under the law of return, as it were, and be counted as a Jew for that purpose. So it's a narrow ruling, but a nice one in that it increases an amount of making the Jewish state a state for all Jews, and I will say that for any of us that have helped donate to the Masorti, the conservative movement in Israel, to the reform movement in Israel, this is partly, I think, thanks to our efforts in that it's that money that helps fund court cases that help bring more justice to individuals who seek to live their Jewish lives in Israel. So it's a good thing. Rabbi Sisi, do you have a 2-minute spiel on this stuff?
I mean, I think you've covered it. Yeah, it's good news. It's very, very good news. It's a long way to go for this to be accepted by all members, if ever, of Israeli society. But this is a long overdue development for pluralism in Israel.
With that, let's talk about Jews. we set up these sessions as a chance to talk about halacha, about Jewish law, and Pesach is overloaded with halachot, and I, for one, like talking about them. I like keeping them, and like all of these other things. I love all of that. But there's been one other thing that's been on one of the halachot of Pesach, in terms of telling the story, that has been on my mind. So it's a little somewhat more agadic than otherwise we might associate with this. But there is a piece of the Passover Seder that I want to talk about that I've been thinking about every year. Something like leaps out from the Haggadah to me. So are we looking at the right thing? You're looking at the page of the Haggadah. And it's the part that comes right after the Manishtana, right? Like if you if you're looking if you in a traditional Haggadah, Magi begins with a Manishtana, the kids sing, it's a very nice moment. And then right after it, we get this line, right? Avdim hayinu leparor mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now that I freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. This is one of the key lines, right? The idea that we were slaves, and the aspect of that I want to focus on, develop just over the course of a couple minutes, is this sense of we. This Haggadah, this is from the Night to Remember, which is an excellent Haggadah. So it begins by re-entering the universe of slavery. We ask ourselves, what was slavery like then? What is it like today? And that aspect, that there's an obligation on Passover to the Avadim Hayinu, to think of ourselves in that situation, is, I think, especially important in times like this. And the reason, really, go through their pieces here, is go back to them, is this, the Ve'ilu, the next line. It's spaced over many pages in this edition, but in a typical Haggadah, it's sort of, this is all one paragraph in most Haggadot. Ve'ilu lo hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu et avatenu mitzrayim harei anu vanenu v'nei vanenu shuvadim hayinu leparor mitzrayim. If God had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, along with our children and our children's children. And there's something about that line that really, really, really stopped me this year, because what's it saying? If God had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, along with their children. Like this, as always, what is it saying, and why is it saying it? What are we supposed to understand about ourselves from this? Actual question.
Is this Q&A or just rhetorical?
Yeah, you can throw out here. Yeah, feel free to.
Well, I mean, the first thing I was thinking, and I apologize if this is wrong, but I mean, if you accept that it was God's will that our slavery ended, wasn't it also God who put us into slavery for all those years in the first place? Like, kind of,
In theory, right? Yeah, so there's that. So you could have a determinist. So this has like a determinist aspect to it, right? You're sort of stuck there, right? There's that theology piece, and that could be, certainly for especially the authors, why that's there. For us, I don't know that that's a primary thing, though it may have been primary for them. I think that is one aspect. These things are multifaceted. I think there are more aspects going on here.
Well, there's a lot of parts of that story, not to presume anything, but throughout the Passover story and the next books is like when the people are listening to God, things go pretty well. And when they don't, then they're wandering the desert for 40 years, and if you think about what happened right before, and again, I'm certainly not claiming to be the expert, weren't the Jews doing sort of okay, like immediately before the Passover story starts? Weren't they sort of all right? They were in Egypt, and the king liked Joseph,
Yeah,
and then we moved there, and
yes, though it's not attributed to their. I mean, the Midrash sometimes says that they were enslaved for their own behavior, though certainly the Torah credits it just to Pharaoh's own xenophobia and bigotry, right? Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, says the Israelites are different and you can't trust them, so we will enslave them. And there's lots of them to boot. So that's here, it's asking something about us.
Doesn't this limit our power? I mean, it says if God took us out, and if not, over 3,000 years, we would still be schlepping along in Egypt. We would not be able to figure out ourselves how to get out of there.
Let's keep building on that. Yes. So this building our power, this is saying that, look, if we were the generation that was enslaved, then we would have been the generation that was enslaved, would be enslaved. And guess what? If God had not taken them out, you know what we would have inherited? Their status, right? This is, I like the way you put it, limiting, isn't this limiting our power? Like, this is saying something about inherited status. If God had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, along with our children, our children's children. This, I think, is suggesting something along the line of what you're saying, which is, or what you're being saying. Wait, is this limited? Does this mean that God determines it all? But even more than that, this acknowledges a certain reality that we're not born into a vacuum, and that it seems part of the halacha on Passover is to understand that you are not born into a vacuum, and I am not born into a vacuum, and that we have certain inherited status, that that because our ancestors were freed, we are free. And if our ancestors had not been free, then we would not be free. And because we are free, our children are free. And if we were not free, then our children would not be free. There's a sense of inherited status here. And it really was looking at this line that that underlines, I often have trouble in our current parlance, or in the current parlance of our society, with people throwing around the word privilege, partly because I feel like it often gets misused. But I'm not convinced that it's an inappropriate word here. Meaning, when the Haggadah says something like this, it's talking about the status that we inherit and that we will pass along. And it asks us to acknowledge that the fact that we are free may not be through any merit of our own, but rather something that was done for those who came before us. And then there's a sort of thing of like the obligations that come onto us, right? Like the very next thing is that there are obligations on you for it. And of course, the whole Seder, the whole structure of everything is to inculcate in us a certain sensibility of what it's like and of who we're supposed to be. So that, I think this year, one of the things that we've the thing that's defined our lives is really, of course, the pandemic, right? That's what our lives have been for the last year, more than anything, right? But also part of this last year, and sort of like really, lest we forget, is the fact of the issues of justice that have roiled our society. This asks us to actually confront that. What status have we inherited? And how are we going to use that? The Haggadah seems to posit that our freedom is something of a privilege that we have inherited, and it asks us to use it wisely. I think that's something that can be generalized out, and I think that's something that we feel especially keenly this year at the Seder. It is doubled. That's from very, very early in the Seder, very, very late in the Seder. A similar thing is said, right? Always my favorite line, many people's favorite line, B'chol dor vador chayav. That's what tips you off that this is okay for a halacha shiur, that it is an obligation. One is obligated. Chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki ilu hu yatza mimitzrayim. שנאמר, והגעת לבניך ביום ההוא לאמור, בעבור זה עשה אדוני לי, יצאתי במצרים. And every generation was obligated to see oneself as one who personally went out from Egypt, just as it says, you should tell your child on that day, it's because of this, like God did for me when I went out from Egypt, right? There's that sense that we're supposed to feel like it's us and to understand that our status is inherited. So this I think is part of this year. Our lives have been dominated by the pandemic. And we can't forget the fact that we're asked to also confront injustice on Passover. That's part of the idea. It's not Jewish Thanksgiving. It's not just a time when we come together with family, though that's a great aspect of it. However, absent that will be or not be this year. It's also supposed to be a day when we wake ourselves up and recognize the world that we're born into and the world that we're asked to create. And these lines, I think, underline it for us this year as much as anything. So that's my halacha for the year. The halacha is to recognize what we've inherited, the status we've inherited, because I think the Haggadah really asks us to look at the statuses that we have inherited, and conversely, to think of the status that others haven't. Zeo, that's my bit. And if you show up enough, my guess is there are weeks and weeks and weeks that I get to talk about Passover before it happens and while it's happening. I like that one, so you might hear it again. The Friedlander Bar Mitzvah is coming up just before Passover. Maybe we'll do it there too. Rabbi.
Shikoach, Rabbi.
Thank you.
So in a twist of things, I'm going to do some like hardcore halacha. Well, not really hardcore, but a little more, little less spiritual. But maybe it is. The punchline is, spoiler alert. Maybe the point of it is something spiritual. Sure. So one of the things that I wanted to start with is, I consider myself, I'm a New Jersey girl, born and bred, spent a lot of time in New York. So in a certain way, I consider myself something of a New Yorker. And, that was maybe said by Gerard Kenny, New York, so nice they named it twice. Not all of my references are Disney, so, I like to branch out a little. But I'm also a proud Jewish person, so I'm going to say Yom Tov, so nice, so we do it twice. And Gerard Kenny's song is meant a little tongue-in-cheek, but what about what I'm saying about Yom Tov? So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to look on your Zoom. So if you have your camera on or off, you can still do this. The little react button at the bottom. If you agree or disagree with what I'm going to say, do you agree with it? Okay, Yom Tov. If you agree, give me a thumbs up, what I'm about to say. Give me a little thumbs up reaction with your Zoom button. If you disagree with me, give me the crying face, the crying, laughing face. And if you're not sure, give me the, I don't know face. Okay. So you got 3 choices on the reactions. Thumb up, crying, thumb up, you agree, crying, you don't agree, and smile, like the shocked face, like you just don't know the answer. Okay. And this is what I'm going to say. Yom Tov, we should have 2 days of it because we like it so much. Gabe's not sure. Okay. All right. And again, you're not going to be held to this. We're not going to make policy based on this. I'm just curious where you're at. You love having a 2-day Yom Tov, give me a thumbs up. If you're like, oy vavoy, 2-day Yom Tov, give me some crying. And if you're like, I'm not sure how I feel about it, haven't really thought about it, give me that. Okay, good. So we had a mixed bag. That's good. That's a good thing. So why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov? We're gonna go into this, but what have you guys heard? Put it in the chat, call it out. What do you know about 2 days and why we have it? Why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov?
Don't
So
we have it do we have it because we're in the diaspora?
Okay, in the diaspora, yes. Point number one. It is
Because the
only, yeah.
because our table is not big enough for everybody we want to invite.
Okay.
I like
yes. We're not in Israel. Good. Our table is not big enough for one, so we have to have more than one. Gabe has a great idea. Do one weekend, because if you don't travel on Yom Tov, you can't go to 2 Sedarim anyway. So do one with one family the first weekend on the first day, do a second Seder on the 7th day with the other family, and then you can travel. Okay, but that's, I'm putting the Seder in front of the horse. I don't even know. Okay. All right, so diaspora, our tables aren't big enough. What else? What else do you know about why we have 2 days of Yom Tov?
I had heard that the reason we have 2 days on Rosh Hashanah was in case somebody didn't know about the first day, they missed it.
Okay, yeah, part of that is there's some questionable stuff going on with the calendar. We might not have the date just right. Rosh Hashanah, by the way, is the only one of our holidays that is also 2 days in Israel. All of the other ones, 1 day Yom Tov, except for Rosh Hashanah. And there's a reason we're not going to have, I could do a whole class on this, but the short version is that Rosh Hashanah is on the first day of the month, and all the other holidays happen on the 15th of the month or the 14th of Adar. That's a little different. But our biblical holidays, Purim is not a biblical holiday, or at least Torah-itic holiday. They all happen at the full moon, which you can imagine why. There's this whole system. We're going to look at the sources, the whole system for how to determine when you had to go out and see when the new moon happened. And you would report the new moon, and then you would count 14 or 15 days from there, 15 days from there. The problem would be if you're in an outlying province, you didn't get the word on the 15th. So you celebrated 1 day just to make sure that you covered it. Okay, but we have a fixed calendar that now. So that might not be the reason. What else? What other reasons do we do this? When in Israel, do I do 2 days or one? Can you have a Seder for one? You can have a Seder for one. And in Israel, there is a tradition that if you are there for the full entirety of the liturgical calendar, so you're going to hit all 3 of the festivals, you can observe Israeli style, even if you are a diaspora Jew. There is also a second opinion that you can not be there for the full entirety of all the holidays and still do 7 days. I subscribe to the second one, and Joel Roth saw me getting pizza when Passover was over. Anyway, good questions. Okay. And nowhere do we have 2 days of Yom Kippur? Yes, Gabe. Yes, because it would be, the rabbis talk about this. It would be a shanda. It would be horrible to make people go without food for 2 full days. Okay, good. Because it's a tradition. Nobody remembers anymore. Mr. Chermak, you were onto something. It's not that we don't remember, but it is a tradition. And spoiler alert, that's where this is heading. Okay. No one here has said, there's one more thing that I'm going to throw on the table before I throw a source out there. Eat the leftovers. Good, Walter. I love it. No one said anything about it's punishment for being in the diaspora. Did anyone ever hear that? Is that something you've heard? Just give me a nod if you've heard. It's like, okay, no, okay, good,
Yeah.
good. Then the message is getting cleared up, because Yom Tov should not be a punishment. It should not be a punishment. It should be a celebration. But there was a sense of that you're punished by being in the diaspora, so you have to keep a second day. I don't buy that. The diaspora is punishment enough, according to the rabbinic tradition. All right. I'm going to bring up a source or two. I'm never going to do this in 15 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. Okay.
Passover itself is kind of a punishment holiday. You're doing a lot of things to remember how bad things were. You're eating foods that are not the normal kind of foods. You're eating the bitter herbs and so on. So I could see that if you want to extend that as kind of a further reminder of what happened.
Yes, and I want to challenge you that we're not necessarily, it's kind of like, so on Purim, I once was chastised, and rightly so, by my religious school teacher when they said, what do we celebrate on Purim? I said, we celebrate that Haman died. I said, no, we don't celebrate that Haman died. We're not celebrating the death of Haman. We're celebrating that we lived. And that little tiny nuance was really important when I was 11, and I learned that. Similarly, on Passover, yes, we remember the bitterness of slavery, and we commemorate it with eating bitter herbs and all of these things. You're 100% right. But we are supposed to then use that to remind ourselves of the good stuff. We're supposed to remember the bad stuff, but to the end of celebrating our freedom and our joyfulness. So it is supposed to be joyful. It's the spring holiday, it's renewal, it's all these wonderful things. It does feel a little bit like it's a burden. We'll talk about that when we get to the Q&A, because I have some thoughts on how to make Passover feel a little less burdensome and more of a celebration of freedom. But why do we do 2 days? All right, so I'm going to give you a quick and dirty explanation. This is from Leviticus. These are the set times of Adonai. This is just to put out there the sacred occasions, which you shall celebrate each at its appointed time. The first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to Adonai. On the 15th day of the month, Adonai's feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread for how many days? 7, and gebrachs on the 8th. No, 7. It doesn't say anything about an 8. Were you going to say that, Rabbi Dan? You were going to say gebrachs, weren't you? Okay. We are supposed to do it for 7 days. So where does this extra day come from? It's not from the Torah. Look at the Mishnah. Messengers were sent out. I love this. There are these kutim, these bad guys who want to mess with our system of getting the word out about the calendar. Messengers were sent out for the following 6 months. For Nisan, that's the one with Passover, the first month. For Av, on the count of the fast, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, and for Elul, on account of the Feast of the New Year. That's the only one that's the first day of the month. Remember, the other ones are in the middle, the 9th of Av and the 14th of Av. So in theory, when you see this moon and you have to get the word out that 2 people saw the new moon and the new month is here, you have time. You have up to 2 weeks to get people the message. Okay. On account of the Feast of the New Year, for Tishrei, on account of the regulation of the festivals, for Kislev, on account of Hanukkah, for Adar, on account of Purim, and for Iyar, during the existence of the second temple, on account of the second Passover. Don't ask about that. That's not covered tonight. Okay. Formerly, in the past, had to say it, fires were lighted on tops of mountains to announce the appearance of the new moon. You guys have seen this in like the Lord of the Rings, right? You see the big mountains, someone lights a fire, someone else sees that fire on their hill and they light the fire, and you pass the message by this series of fires. But the Kutim, ever the jokesters and pranksters, led the nations into error. It was ordained that messengers should be sent out because the Kutim would like to screw with us and they would start lighting fires, or at least that's what the story tells us. So instead, they sent out messengers, and this is the problem with messengers. 2 other witnesses came and said, we saw the moon on its proper day, but could not see it on the next evening of the intercalary day. Rabbi Gamliel received them. Rabbi Bendosa and Hyrcanus said, they are false witnesses, for how can they testify of a woman giving birth on a certain day when on the next day she appears with her belly in her teeth? Like, you can't see the moon and then the moon disappear is what they're trying to say here. It says, I approve of your opinion. Okay. So this is this whole thing that there's a little bit of there's an unreliability of the witnesses. There need to be 2 of them. And there's a little bit of a power struggle going on here. So this system wasn't really loved by everyone. Okay, moving to the Talmud, which takes this Mishnah and discusses it. Okay, let me sort of see what I want to, okay, originally, oops, don't do that. Oh, that was okay. They would light torches, and this is the Mishnah, right? After the Kutim undermined this message, the sages instituted that messengers be dispatched. The Mishnah implies that there were Kutim that were, this is the important part, were the Kutim eliminated, torch signaling would be resumed, and we would all observe 1 day of Yom Tov, right? Remember, the whole point is when you had fires, you got 1 day because everyone saw the fires, they lit their fire, and the message got out there a lot faster than 2 people on foot or on horses. Now you have these messages. So this implication is the only reason we do 2 days is because the messengers might not be right. And you have to wait till you see the sun, the moon for 2 days and know that it really was the new moon. Well, once we don't have to rely on these unreliable messengers anymore, we can go back to fires and have 1 day of Yom Tov. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Now that we know, and this is in time of the Talmud already, this isn't even like conservative Judaism in the 21st century. Now that we know when Rosh Chodesh is established, because we have a fixed calendar, we're not waiting for people to sit around and tell us when the moon is coming up. We have a calendar. Y'all have it. You get it from the funeral homes, right? Everyone has a Jewish calendar or an app if you're one of those people. Look, I have an Israeli flag on my phone. Okay. Now that we know when Rosh Chodesh, first of the month, is established, what is the reason we do the 2 days? Because of the message they sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia. Be careful with, this is Mr. Chermak, this was Josh's thing. Be careful with the custom of your forefathers that is in your hands. Someday the government may promulgate a decree and you will come to err. There's a fear here, by the way, that second line is less important, but there's a fear that we won't be able to use our Jewish calendars and then we will be will be lost because we won't be using it and the government might interfere. But this line, be careful with the custom of your forefathers that is in your hand. Be careful. We have to, this is the general tenet. And this is what when we make halachic decisions in 2021, we, not just about second day Yom Tov, this teaching is sort of really important because it's like, well, that's how we've always done it, is not always a bad thing, right? There's a sense that you shouldn't do it just because you've always done it, but there is a strong preservation of the things we've always done as being important to us. So we weigh that. We weigh the tradition of our ancestors. We don't need to have a second day of Yom Tov. In fact, the Gemara basically says, well, if we ever get to a place where we can reliably transmit this information, we don't need 2 days of Yom Tov. And are we at that place? Yes, you all have your funeral home calendars. You know when Passover falls. You don't need to worry. You don't need to have that second day just in case you got the date wrong. Okay, so that's where the origin of this comes from. I'm going to fast forward to the end. There's this whole sort of difference that I'd love to get into if we were doing a more in-depth study of this, about the different, and we've talked about this in our series already, this idea of what is a chok, what is an immutable law, what is, what's the other one? I'm blanking on the name of the word. There's 3 things. There's chok, something else. What?
Response? What are you looking for?
No, I want to say, I think it's gezerah, but that's not it. I'm absolutely brain farting. Well, in any event, there's 3 different levels. There's an immutable law. There's a kind of law that you can change. And then there's minhag, custom. Like wearing a kippah is a custom, but God forbid anyone not wear one. It's become so enforced and so a part of who we are that it has the force of law. But they do have different weight in terms of what you can and cannot change. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about what gays and lesbians and LGBTQI interests. We talked about that there are different levels of what you can change and how you go about changing them. I want to also just reiterate in the course of these conversations that Judaism does not say that our laws cannot be changed. In fact, they can. There's just a system for it, right? There's an app for that. There's a way to do it. It's not mishpat. It's not mishpat, guys. It'll come to me before the end. It's probably in my notes here somewhere. The Lord of the Rings scene queued up. Awesome. Okay, hold on. So it's not really that, Jonathan. It's that it's pure and simple that you didn't know if day X was if day X was day 1 of the month, then the 15th would fall on day 15. If day X plus 1 was the first day of the month, then the 15th would be 15 plus 1. It would be the 16th, the next day. So you had to be careful. It was really just an unsurety thing. It was not to make sure that we were all observing it at the same time. Although that's a good midrashic way of looking at it. Okay, yes. That's true. Thank you. Gabe is like you should at some point have him teach you his shtick on Jewish calendar. My husband is a mathematician and he really likes the math of this, that every month was either 29 or 30 days in the lunar calendar and you didn't always know. Now we know. Now we have a better sense of how that works out. Okay. Fast forwarding. Also remembering to breathe because I don't do that. Okay. So there's one place where I am curious that none of you, here we go. Let me just say what Rambam says. This is Maimonides. Yeah, all right, I'm going to read Maimonides because he actually makes this a little clearer for us. Therefore, the inhabitants of all the places, here we go. Let's read this. In the present era, when the Sanhedrin no longer exists and the courts of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, establishes the month according to the fixed calendar, according to law, it would be appropriate for Jews throughout the world to celebrate the holiday for 1 day alone. This is Rambam saying this, right? He's medieval. Already medieval, we're talking about this. For the inhabitants of the distant regions of the diaspora and the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, rely on the same fixed calendar and establish the festivals accordingly. Nevertheless, the sages ordained that the inhabitants of the diaspora retain their customs of their ancestors. Therefore, the inhabitants of all the places the messengers of Tishrei would not reach in the era where the messengers were sent out should be celebrate 2 days even in the present era, just as they did. They're basically saying the diaspora. If you're outside of, he imagines that the messengers could reach in time, they would reach the land of Israel. Outside of it, maybe not. So outside of the land of Israel. Okay. In the present era, the inhabitants of Eretz Israel continue their custom and celebrate one day, for they never celebrated 2 days. Thus, our celebration of second day of the holidays in the diaspora at present is a rabbinic institution. Remember, that's the difference. You can change stuff if it's rabbinic versus, it's a little complicated, but just go with that for now. Okay, he says our celebration of every holiday for 2 days in the diaspora is merely a custom. For the second day of the holiday is a rabbinic institution, innovated during the exile, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now, this is a whole other thing about whether it's one single day. Rosh Hashanah is kind of considered one single day. These are 2 separate days. It's a complicated thing. But this is the place where I'm curious. None of you have heard the sort of Baba Misa that it's because we're being punished. Yeah. This is the only place where it comes up as sort of like a punishment, where he says, the community of Israel said to the Holy One, because I did not observe one day of Yom Tov in the land of Israel as fully prescribed by our laws, I'm now obligated to observe 2 days of Yom Tov in exile outside the land of Israel. That's like, you couldn't get it done in one day. You have to do it for 2 days. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. So in conclusion, so this is our traditional reason for 2 days. Be careful with the custom of your forefathers that is in your hands. Someday the government may promulgate a decree and you will come to err. We want to preserve the traditions of our forefathers and foremothers. That's legit. That's legit. So there is this sense that even though we don't need to, we do it because we want to keep that tradition, because generations of Jews in the diaspora have done this. And we want to make sure that that tradition is safe. Nobody ever gives a good reason why, but okay. The reform reasoning for 1 day is basically what we talked about before. During the ordinance, basically that, I'm not going to read it, but basically this idea that we don't have to worry about the Kutim with their fires. We don't have to worry about the messengers being unreliable or coming late. We have a fixed calendar. So there's no reason to keep this extra day. Now there are 2 responsa, like the ones we've been reading from the conservative movement, going the reality. I love this. There's a little snarkiness. Incidentally, this guy over here, Siegel, the one he argues for getting rid of second day of Yom Tov, and he writes a responsa, a teshuva on this. He has to make some compelling arguments. He's also the same guy who wrote why we should have musical instrumentation in Shabbat way back in the 60s. He talked about organs. Okay. In reality, through our insistence on keeping the second day as a Yom Tov, we become machshilei harabim, misleaders of thousands of our congregation. He makes the case. This is the case for why perhaps we should get rid of second day Yom Tov. If it's not really Yom Tov, if you're going to come, if you've got day 7 and day 8 of Passover, you can come to shul on the 7th day, or you can come to shul on the 8th day. Which day has Yizkor? Anyone?
Second.
The 8th day. Well, in Passover, it's day 8.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The 8th day.
But you're right. It's the second day. We put Yizkor on the second day of every Yom Tov. Shavuot, it's on day 2, right? It's on day 7 on Passover. It's curious that we then make a reason to attend the day that is arguably not the holiday. So in a sense, it's almost like if that's not really the holiday and day 7 is actually the holiday, we've just created this world where people come on day 8. And he's making the case that if we got rid of second day, which isn't necessary, we'd have people coming on the actual Yom Tov. And there's a case to be made for that. In our modern day, we're not communities that go to shul every day. We just aren't. We make choices. And he's saying, as a conservative rabbi in the 60s, that the choices we make, we want people to come on the actual holiday. And he says this right here. Our synagogues are crowded, halavai that they were crowded, on the eve of Simchat Torah, or the Hakafot, which is not a holiday at all. It's actually the 9th day, but empty on the eve of Shmini Atzeret. Nobody even knows what Shmini Atzeret is. Let's be real about this. Thus, by trying to maintain a custom, we cause our people to disregard the law. You come on Simchat Torah, you don't come on Shmini Atzeret. You come on Yizkor, you don't come on the actual day of Chag. He said there's a lot of people who were then arguing that being permissive towards the second day will not improve the sanctity of the first day. People will be just less strict in the whole thing. He's trying to say, if you got to do one, do this one because it's actually the holiday. And then he says this other really interesting thing that I like. It is a matter of some spiritual significance to move toward the coordination of all diaspora religious occasions with those in Israel. It's a Zionist move to say that we do this because we want to be in solidarity with Israel. It'd be a move in strengthening the unification of the Jewish people and their sacred days. Fun fact, if our 8th day of Passover falls on Shabbat and it's not the 8th day of Passover in Israel, they move on with their Torah reading and we're off from the Torah reading for a good number of weeks, which is weird. We're not all reading the same Torah across the world. It's a little bit strange. Now, of course, as true to what we know about conservative Judaism, there was a response disagreeing with this one. And this one said, those Jews who do not want to observe Yom Tov, I love this line. This is the snarkiest thing in the world, and I love it so much. Ready? Those Jews who do not want to observe Yom Tov and find the extra day a burden already have an option. The only option that should be created, Aliyah to Israel. Boom. Like, is that so harsh? He's making a case that he's like, yeah, you don't want to do Yom Tov. And he's also, I think, under his breath saying you can move to Israel or don't do Yom Tov. There's a curious sociological thing going on with the conservative movement piece that it's more talking about communities observing Yom Tov Sheni rather than individuals. Okay. So, and he also wants to remind us here, so much is written and said about the burden of a second day of Yom Tov that it might be a place to note that not all Jews find it a burden. Some find it a blessing. Some look upon it as replete with so much joy that they would like to find a reason for a third day. And then he talks about the second Seder, Simchat Torah. It is, a climactic day to the high holidays. If you've ever been to Israel and you've done Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah on the same day, you're praying for rain, you're saying Yizkor, and you're dancing around for all those hakafot. It's a long service. So there is something to be said for splitting them. But I do love what he says here, that maybe we need to reconsider how we frame second day Yom Tov, right? Second day full of meals, second day full of prepping, second day of abstaining from certain work and certain activities, second day of going to shul. There is the sense that that's a burden, and there's a move to get rid of that burden to lighten the load on those who observe those days. But I like this guy, even though he's crotchety about move to Israel, I like that he says, Shuchat says, that this is about spiritual practice, and the holidays are given to us with the intention of making our spiritual practice greater. So on the one hand, there are no real reasons to sort of increase our holidays, but on the other hand, maybe there is a reason to add more joy to our lives. And lastly, as Josh Chermak said right at the very beginning, is that it's tradition. It's a tradition. That's why we do it, right? And there's something kind of beautiful about this idea that even though it's not something we need to be doing anymore, and again, it's different, right? It's different if you say, well, it's tradition that rabbis are men, for example. You're stepping on someone's human rights, and sort of egalitarianism is a different category than Yom Tov Sheni. It's not hurting anyone's identity to say that we're going to add to the holiness and hold on to this tradition that no longer really has value. I mean, I am definitely on an intellectual level in favor of getting rid of second day Yom Tov. On a spiritual level, I'm not sure. I think we need more joy. We need more celebration, and our holidays are celebrations. And so the more of them, the better. So I want to do one last poll. I'm grossly gone over my 15 minutes. All right. If you use a little reaction button, if you have been convinced that we should get rid of second day Yom Tov, give me a thumbs up because you want to get rid of it. Give me a crying face because you don't want to get rid of it. We're a mixed bunch again. We are definitely, and Gabe is still unsure. That's my husband. I live with that man. Yeah, there's something to it. Like, it's hard to give up the traditions, right? That we do things the way that our ancestors did them is a good thing, like tradition, Lador Vador, from generation to generation. But on the other hand, there are strong, compelling reasons to consolidate so that you're doing Yizkor and coming to shul on the day that is really, we know our calendar, it's fixed now. And if you go back to the sources, the Gemara, the Talmud says, well, if we don't have a reason for second day Yom Tov, we should get rid of it. So there's something to be said for both views. We'll see at the ritual committee to make a decision. Anyway, that's all. Hope you enjoyed that.
Ugh,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Rabbi Artson, a teacher, had a version of what you said. He would say that because we would ask the same question. Is it worthwhile for people still to be doing this? He said, the people who don't want to show up on second day Yom Tov have an option. Go to work. So yeah. Though all the things was before, and then people. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So here's the deal. Here's where we're at. We're going to. I want to have some session sometime for some back and forth. If I may suggest, we should start out because it's fresher in people's minds. Start out if you have questions about what I think specifically what Rabbi Sisi just taught. Let's start with that second day Yom Tov stuff, things like that, which is just a little halachic note for that is significant on Pesach. Though it's worth noting that even many people, Reform movement, when they're that don't do, it's not true in Israel, but in the diaspora, even people who want to drop second day Yom Tov often don't drop second Seder.
Second Seder, yeah. Also, the interesting thing, I made a joke about at the beginning that might have been a little, over the head, but was that even in some communities that, there are some Jewish communities where they are so strict about sort of their adherence to what you can and cannot eat, like the matzah, that they won't eat this, what they call gebrocks. And gebrocks is basically your matzah balls, right? Taking matzah meal and soaking it in water in some way, which means most of the cooking we do on Passover is forbidden to that community. And that community on the 8th day, because it's not really Yom Tov anymore, will have matzah ball soup and have their gebrocks because it's not really forbidden anymore. So I find that fascinating. And that's part of a community that we would consider very observant, whatever that means, right? So it's just an interesting, interesting thing. But like I said, Gabe's solution to the problem would be, so especially if you're someone who observes and does not drive, and you can't go to two different Seders with two different sets of in-laws, to do one Seder on night 1 and the second Seder the next week on night 7.
So we'll pause. If there are questions about either the teachings, cue those up. And I'll leave a moment or two for that.
Wouldn't you be taking away from tradition? I would say you did away with the second Seder night. I mean, to me, Jewish tradition holds so much of our religion. I just, I have a hard time taking away from the tradition.
Yeah, then that's exactly what the rabbis of the Talmud said, and the Mishnah said. They said, the tradition, the minhag of our ancestors is in our hands. However, I don't think we're suggesting that. I feel like you can do a Seder on a Chol HaMoed day of Pesach. You could still do a Seder. So it's just, you wouldn't have to get up and go to shul in the morning and the same day.
The question is right. No, the question is not with blessings and things like that, right? Then it'd be
well, you're right. Okay, no, that's fair.
That's part of right, but to Ellen's point, to what Rabbi Z said, that's exactly their point. Like you can't do it, which is I have a hard time picturing this sort of like rolling into work with bagel in hand or something like that on what would be the 8th day of Pesach. Like it's just sort of like I have a hard time picturing that. Like how could that even be? It's a 9 days after Pesach begins, of course. 8 days. But yeah, that's sort of what so much of Judaism goes on is less is on some level the details of things, and on some level it's like the feel. And I think for many people, the feel of it is what it is.
But it's interesting because even under the present construct, second day Yom Tov, you could make a case that those blessings are levatala because it's not really a Yom Tov, and we know that. So but we get away with it. So that's why I'm wondering if you could still get away with it but again,
yes, well, I think that's to the point, meaning that all those blessings, if there are problems with Maimonides' conception, right? If it is just a tradition, then there's a lot of things. Well, I don't know if it's a mitzvah from the Torah to wrap tefillin, say, then I'm not doing that on 8th day Passover, if in fact I'm supposed to be, right? Or there are blessings that I am saying then, if I'm saying the blessing for Passover or Kiddush, then I'm using God's name in vain because I'm saying something at the right. So yeah, there's a lot of ins and outs on it.
Yeah, look,
Not
it's,
suggesting that we're about to do this.
no,
is-
no, no,
is
no.
lots
I,
of
you know,
points.
I did, I will, full confession time. I was a member of a synagogue where we chose, and again, it's hard to do it unilaterally with one synagogue. If the whole conservative movement chose to do this, it would be a different conversation. But it's a hard sell for one synagogue to do this. And I did work at a synagogue that did. And the challenge was, it was fine. Okay, we're not doing a second day Yom Tov service. Fine, whatever. We're doing Yizkor on day one. Fine, whatever. But where the challenge happened is you sell your chametz till the end of Passover. And you had to make a decision. Are you willing to say that you own your chametz after sundown of the seventh day? And that was a hard one for people to swallow. And that was a hard thing to understand, that if you believe that Passover is actually 8 days and you're keeping Passover for 8 days, you don't want to own that chametz by the end of the seventh day, which if you did the certificate, the shtar, the document from that synagogue, you ended up having your chametz owned again.
Rabbi, I worked for AT&T in the past. And a conversation like this, I would usually say, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So you had a shul that went from 8 days to 7 days for Pesach.
Mhm.
Why? And did you accomplish what you wanted to accomplish? Or is there a way to measure whether you accomplished what you wanted to accomplish?
So good question. So I might not have been as clear that the problem that people want to solve. It's a very good question. Is the sense of shuls are getting filled. This is the conservative movement in the 60s, right? The time of the driving tshuva kind of stuff, where we're trying to find a way to bring meaning to diaspora conservative suburban Jews in America. And if they're all coming to dance with the Torah on Simchat Torah, and they're all coming to come for Yizkor, but none of them are coming on Shemini Atzeret, which is ostensibly the actual day of the holiday, a more important holiday, if you're putting air quotes around it, it is the first day of Yom Tov. Well, the problem that they sought to solve was, people are giving, they're transgressing a law, which Shmini Atzeret is the law, in order to observe a minhag, which is Simchat Torah. And so the problem that these respondents seek to solve is, how do we get people to come to shul on the day that is the right day? Now that's one problem. The second problem, if you read the whole responsa, is that for those I'll use myself, for someone like me who does go to shul on all days and is always davening and is finding meaning in it, but like a 3-day chag is like killer with the meals and the prep work, this also keeps those people in mind that maybe that's too much. Maybe too much of a good thing is too much of a good thing. So you may not, Alan, agree with those problems that they're trying to solve, but those are the problems that they're trying to solve, is that attendance isn't working out on the days that are law days. People are coming on minhag days, and they wanted to find a way to somehow rectify that problem. And there's also this sense of the diaspora being separate from Israel is maybe not necessarily where we are in the 20th, 21st centuries.
So did people show up on the right day after you made the change?
Yeah. So in my particular synagogue's case, yeah, they did. We just had to, we did it as a trial for a year. Passover was a challenge because what was going to happen is it did end up happening one year that all of a sudden our Torah readings are off. And 2 years prior to that, we had assigned bar mitzvah dates. So it was a lot of, so we had to figure out creative solutions for figuring out how to get all that in. Did it work? I don't know. I mean, yes, because people still come for Simchat Torah and don't come for Shmini Atzeret. So now they've come for the combination holiday of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. So I'm glad that we're not selling Hamlets. I was a little confused.
But Rabbi Sisi, they
Mhm.
only did it for 1 year.
No, they did it for 3. They tried it for 1, worked out the kinks, and I believe they still do it.
Oh, okay.
Yep. But the idea was to try it for a year and get people used to it. Then they worked out the kinks. So now we know that we're on the reform / Israel. They are on that schedule for reading Torah. Look, I'm not suggesting we do it. I just think it's a fun exercise in how halacha, even in the times of the Gemara, we're talking about the time of the Talmud, that halacha isn't decided. I mean, this is sort of one of the things about this course is it's not decided in a vacuum. There's sociological and psychological concerns are also brought in. There's also this idea we don't celebrate a second day of Yom Kippur. That would be burdensome. And there's a sense of, there's another concept of Bal Tosif. We're not supposed to add on to stuff. And it says, 6 days shall you work as a positive commandment, right? Like it says you shall eat Passover matzah for 7 days. Why are we adding another day? There's a sense of that for no good reason. What they're saying is if it's no longer joyous, if your idea of what a second day Yom Tov or 3 days when it's conjoined with Shabbat is burdensome, then maybe it's time to find a way to lighten that burden. Again, I'm not saying I agree. Please don't go. Rabbi Zizi wants to get rid of second day Yom Tov. That's not what I'm saying. I just think it's a really interesting thing that despite all the evidence that suggests that even 2,000 years ago, the rabbis were like, yeah, we probably don't need to do this anymore, but we're going to do it. It's like, the story of why is it, daughter sees mom making a brisket and daughter takes the brisket, chops off the end before putting it into the brisket pan. And she says, Mom, why do you always cut off that end of the brisket? Why do you do that? She's like, I don't know. My mother did it too. Your grandma did it too. And they go and ask grandma why she cut the tushy off of the end of the brisket. And grandma says, oh, it's because the pan I had was 2 inches too short for the brisket from our butcher. So I had to cut it off before putting it in the pan. Right. So the reason for the minhag doesn't hold up necessarily, but there's something beautiful in the fact that you're remembering your grandma by cutting off the butt of your brisket, like it's cool. So there is something to that. The question this will be my last thought, is that you have to be careful when it's, and I don't say this for anyone in this room. This is just, I'm using I got early in my career, ordaining women in our movement for close to 40 years. I know, Rabbi, I'm fine with women rabbis, but my uncle isn't. And so for the funeral, we want a man. It's just, it just feels more traditional to us. I would get that. Now that is a different conversation about why the sociological and the psychological piece needs to be reevaluated. But we're talking about an extra day of eating matzah. We're not talking about something in terms of basic human dignity. So to know that halacha in lots of different ways balances all of those things.
Then just to wrap up, when I was in rabbinical school in Los Angeles, we didn't learn that the second day of Yom Tov was a punishment for being in the diaspora. And you were in the diaspora. In LA, it was quite enjoyable to celebrate Yom Tov Sheni, but there are some opinions that it is a punishment if you are celebrating it in New Jersey. So I think that's one of the differences that might pop up over in different places. All right, so we'll pause there. We're going to transition. I also, before we sign off, I just want to check if there are any other Passover questions, sort of more general Passover questions that pop up. Last year was a unique year. Last year, of course, when Passover hit right around the time when grocery shopping was difficult, was especially difficult, when we were just hitting the pandemic, and it was reasonable that that in certain situations that some restrictions could be eased, not the Torah restrictions, as it were, as we've talked about ad nauseam. The Torah and the rabbinic are on slightly different levels. You still can't eat chametz, you can't eat bread or pasta or anything like this. But some of the things that we're 99.9% sure don't have chametz in them, but we have some level of doubt, like things like that. Purchase for Passover were permitted because last year for us and our family was the first year we ever used the dishwasher, because early in the pandemic we had a great concern over how is COVID-19 transmitted. Now, so we wanted to sterilize everything as much as we could, so we used the dishwasher for the first time on Pesach. This year, look, it was awesome to use the dishwasher. It was totally great, but but I can't use that argument anymore. We now know no one's getting COVID-19 from not having dishwasher heavy sterilized dishes. Birthday to be celebrated on Passover. Eitan's birthday is 8th day of Pesach. So there are things that were different last year. This year, obviously, what's different will be primarily in terms of how Seders are celebrated. But I also wanted to pause to see if there were any outstanding questions that people have, either unique to COVID period or in general, what about this, what about that, that were out there.
Well, Rabbi, I wanted to touch
Sorry.
on something we had discussed on one of the previous Tuesday calls where we were talking about observance of Shabbat during the pandemic and use of video and stuff like that. I'm remembering, you just reminded me last year for Pesach, there was a lot of discussion. I think we had a chat about it, about whether or not it was appropriate to have the Seder on Zoom. And some people are like, you shouldn't have it on Zoom and not. And I know that you and Rabbi Sisi have had a lot of thoughts about that. I was wondering if just for a couple of minutes, could we, in reflection of that previous session we had, do you have any thoughts about Passover having the Seder on Zoom?
I think this year, like last year, we were all doing like severe lockdown. This year, it's obviously eased somewhat, and God willing, will be eased even more by the end of the month. Though this year, my guess is, I think it is appropriate to have Zoom Seders again. Rabbi Sisa and I have talked about doing just this again, and same as last year, my Zooming out our first Seder and her zooming out her second. And it's for the same reason. I think it's important again that we take care of ourselves and ensure that we're around to celebrate more Pesachs, and this is one way to do it. And I think it's hard, as I mentioned before, to get to it from the halachic, from the details. It's a sociological issue that people experience Shabbat, experience Pesach in a community, Seder especially in a group, and this is a way to affect it for people who are at risk. I, for one, in 12 hours and 40 minutes, hope to get my shot. So I'm looking to be clear. But who's counting? But yeah, this I think for many people, a Zoom Seder will be indicated again this year.
What is the deal with when people can't buy bread like after Passover? Like it's got a I don't even know how to describe it, but what's that about? Because you can't
own. I'm sorry, Sir Rabbi, did you want to?
Because
you can't. Jews can't own chametz on Pesach. It becomes treif. Like my box of. If I own a box of pasta on Pesach, it is treif forever for all Jews because it became a prohibited item during Passover. Because the Torah says you can't own this thing, so it becomes prohibited. So that's why if you look in something like the OU guide, I know in the Toronto Orthodox Rabbinate, in their guide as well, would always publish the names of stores owned by Jews who didn't, and like if they, the ones that were like known to be owned by Jews, where the chametz was sold over Pesach, so that you knew it was okay. So because the chametz owned on Pesach is, if it's owned by a Jew, it becomes not okay. A lot of those kashrut guides will tell you like what is okay. So that's part of it. The other thing is it's at the beginning of the holiday, you can't have things made on Yom Tov. So if something was made on Yom Tov, you're not supposed to be buying it on Chol HaMoed. Yeah, so that's part of why chametz has to be sold. It makes everything kosher for consumption.
But you know what? I'm talking about when you go to the supermarket after Passover, and like some people, some more observant people, like can't buy bread for a certain number of days because I don't know, maybe it was produced during Yontif, or I don't know. Do you know? Did that answer my question? I'm not sure. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Rabbi Sisi, I'm not sure.
That many for many days. I know it's usually like that day, like in Israel, you have to wait for them to buy back their chametz that night and make the pizza fresh kind of thing. But I don't
Okay.
think it's day. I mean, I don't know in terms of supply chains, but it's just long enough for them to come into ownership of the materials to make the bread, re-kosher thing, like not re-kosher, but like re-establish the kitchen and make the
Okay.
stuff.
Okay. Thanks.
Right. All I can think of is that if they're doing it for you, they're not supposed to, nothing's supposed to be done for you on a Shabbat or a holiday when you can't do it. So you have to wait until after, like the amount of time it would take for it to be done afterwards. But I'm not sure if that's relevant in this specific situation. So I'm not quite sure. Others. And if not, or if you're formulating something, then I would make one last point, which is this year Passover first night of Passover is on a Saturday night, which means that all the Ta'anit Bechorot, that the fast of the firstborn, is technically on that Thursday. So you're not supposed to have a fast on a Friday, and all the Bedikat Chametz is Thursday night. You set aside a small amount of chametz, like a couple of chalot, maybe, to be eaten on Friday night at Shabbat dinner and things like this. Maybe Saturday early, which is to say that I think the cutoff time for eating chametz is 10 a.m. on Saturday. So generally just for Friday night, and sort of like be very careful about sweeping out the crumbs and throwing them away, because those crumbs aren't supposed to be around. So there's an added difficulty of Saturday night seders in having Pesach and having Challah on Friday, and then moving on from there.
I missed what you said. Search for chametz is Thursday night?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, B'dichat Chametz is Thursday, I think.
Yeah, has to be Thursday night, Friday morning. Like the burning is Friday morning.
Right. That's funny. The reason I just said is I looked up at my calendar. Oddly enough, not a funeral home calendar, which has our names on it. But it has search for chametz on Friday on there, but I don't think that's the case.
When is fast of the firstborn?
That Thursday. Meaning that it's Thursday. Thursday the 25th is when that is. Now I don't know. I haven't thought far enough ahead as to what we can or could do for it and things like that, but we'll figure it out.
We have to have our own food.
Right.
One thing I found interesting when talking to my daughter, she said she would rather have Seder on Saturday night than Friday night because it's easier. I'm not sure how that works, but.
You can cook again on Saturday night. You can be heating and warming things. You just can't do that Friday night. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be more difficult, but
So look how much fun we have on Pesach. Why would you want to have one less day?
Exactly. Well,
You doing the cooking?
I was gonna say, who's doing the cooking and the cleaning and the koshering in your house?
I do a lot of it. That's why I can say it, especially with my wife listening.
And you think it's fun?
I love it.
Come to my house this year.
I love it.
I want you all to know this is my husband's favorite holiday, and yes, he does help with a lot of the cleaning. And this year he's going to end up doing a lot of the cooking because Linda can't stand very long. So
now I actually love, I mean, we touched on this at the beginning. Like I love Passover as the celebration of freedom and renewal. And one of the things I debated talking about tonight was this idea of, and it feels a little tone deaf in the time of the pandemic, but one of my favorite things to sort of think about is we spend so much time getting rid of our physical chametz, like making sure we don't have a teensy little crumb. By the way, you don't have to clean your bathtub for Passover unless you regularly eat in it. right? Passover cleaning is not meant to be spring cleaning, although that's a good thing to do. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it's meant to be getting rid of chametz and the crumbs that you have around your house. But we spend so much time on this physical chametz that I like to encourage people to think of the spiritual chametz, the other stuff that makes you bloated. And I don't mean bloated literally. I mean like the stuff that's weighing you down. And this is an opportunity, right? On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we become cleansed and have a clean slate. This is another Rosh Hashanah. This is another new year where we have the opportunity, and in the spring, in the first month of the calendar is Nisan, is the Passover month, to really just sort of take stock of who we are and where we're going and look for ways to rid ourselves of the stuff, the bloat, the stuff that weighs us down, the spiritual chametz. So this year being a weird year, like I give people a lot more of a wide berth to be grumpy and to be weighed down. We're all weighed down right now, but maybe all the more so we need an opportunity to say, I'm going to work on scrubbing my kitchen and I'm going to put away the stuff and I'm going to get the kosher for Passover egg kichels and I'm going to do all of that. But I'm also going to take like 15 minutes before the Seders, if you can spare more, and just really take some self-stock and be like, what do I want to let go of? What's weighing me down? Is it something in my closet? Is it actually physical stuff that I want to clear out? Or is it something inside of me? Am I holding on to a grudge? Am I holding on to some bad feelings? Do I have regrets? Something like that. So I love this idea. So pay close attention. That halakha says you have to get all those crumbs out of your kitchen. Don't worry about your bathroom, but also work on that uplifting, that spiritual uplifting that we can all use right now. So
Nicely done. I think that is a appropriate note to end on. If you have Passover questions along the way, please feel free to contact either Rabbi Sisi or me. Rabbis enjoy getting Passover questions. I will soon, I put the link to selling chametz in the chat, and that will be sent out, as well as the RA Passover guides and things like that. I'll put online for everyone to access. And till then,
also, if you have, just to say as a way of, it's a month, we've got time, not the whole month, but your rabbis love you and want you and you have questions on the how-tos of Pesach, give us a buzz. If you want to help with your chametz, your prep, or your spiritual chametz removal, I'm happy to chat about that.
Thanks so
Both
much.
of us are.